Hello everyone, this is Ted Baumann here. I am Chief of Global Diversification here at International Living. A few days back, I wrote about a proposal in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which would slap a 3.5% tax on money transfers sent from the United States to foreign countries by non-citizens. Now remember, non-citizens includes a lot of people who are legally in the United States, like permanent residents, for example, green card holders. My concern about the bill initially was that it would catch US citizens in its provisions because banks and money transfer agencies tend to want to avoid risk and therefore would leave the onus on US citizens to prove their citizenship rather than deduct the fees. Now, that turns out to be accurate because a lot of the reaction to the initial proposal came from Americans who said, well, what about the money I send abroad to pay for my kid's college tuition? He or she studies overseas. What about people using ATMs in foreign places? And just as I predicted, it's led to a game of whack-a-mole where it's become clear that in the world we live in today, there are so many ways to transfer money from one country to another, and so many ways to, in a sense, get around requirements for citizenship documentation that the whole thing is turning out to be a fiasco. Now, the Senate actually, in its revised version of the bill, reduced the 3.5% excise to 1%. So on one hand, or in one sense, that's a victory. So instead of the initial 5%, which was subsequently reduced to 3.5% by the Congress, it's now 1%. There's no telling what the motivation was for the reduction, whether it was to assuage fears of US citizens and so on, but the bottom line remains that the 1% excise tax was in the bill as passed by the Senate and therefore was enacted into law when the House ratified the Senate's changes and passed the bill late last week. Now, what that means is that it now stands as law, that anybody who is not a US citizen who sends 1%, who sends money abroad will have to pay a 1% excise tax to the US government. That's not supposed to apply to US citizens, but we'll have to wait to see how that works out in practice. But here's the thing. A lot of reporters have done some digging on this issue, and it turns out that this particular provision was aimed squarely at non-documented immigrants in the United States and others that the Republican Party believes should not be in the United States and should not be getting any benefits from being in the United States. There have been other taxes imposed and other benefits that have been reduced and eliminated for people who are undocumented residents of the United States, and also people who are legally in the United States but are not yet citizen. And the argument is that these were developed as ways to plug the absolutely massive $3 trillion tax hole that the One Big Beautiful Bill has created. Now, I am not really in a position to comment on that because I wasn't part of the deliberations when these provisions were inserted into the bill, but it certainly makes sense. The Republicans are both trying to raise money on paper in order to get the bill through the Congressional Budget Office, but they're also trying to send a message to people: don't come to the United States, we don't want you. And if you do, we will figure out ways to tax you, to eliminate benefits from you, to prevent you from being able to access certain benefits. And that will make your life more difficult. Now, the 1% provision, as I said, is in the bill. I still stand by what I said in the rest of this video, so let's have a look at that. The first question somebody asked, which I thought was quite interesting, is what other countries do this, if any? Well, there are quite a few. India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Tanzania all tax outgoing money transfers. Now, some of them, like India and Nigeria, only tax above certain amounts. In other words, if you are sending money out of those countries, depending on how much it is, you could pay a transfer duty. But for most minor transactions, it's not charged. The other countries, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Ethiopia, it's not a great country for or company for the US to be in, but there we are. So these countries mainly do that in order to prevent capital outflows, to prevent or discourage people from sending money out of the country because it weakens their economies, because they struggle to bring in money in the form of foreign exchange, foreign currency. So the United States is obviously not doing it for that reason. Why is it doing this? Well, The most honest answers that I've been able to find in the press come from people who weren't willing to be quoted, who worked on the bill, who said the real reason is to discourage foreigners from coming to this country to work by effectively taxing them on their earnings to prevent them, or to make it less lucrative, if you like, to come to the United States. Not a great idea, not a great way to do it. I don't think at the end of the day it's going to stop many people from coming to the US to work. It's just going to be an irritation. And that irritation will extend, as I explained last week, to US citizens. Because who's going to do this? Who's going to verify this? Well, if I were a money transfer company or a bank, as I said last week, I would simply assume that everybody is covered by this law, and I would deduct the 3.5% and say, you sort it out when you do your taxes at the beginning of next year. It's simply the most risk-averse stance they can take, and they do have a tendency to be that way when it comes to international financial transactions. Now, they can do this because non-citizen workers are vulnerable. They can't vote. Nobody pays any attention to what they say politically. But those of us who are U.S. citizens who fall under this do have something to say, and I've encouraged people to try to contact their politicians, their congressmen and senators, and express concerns. Whether they listen to us is anybody's guess, because remember, there's a lot of us and we're scattered all over the world, and we don't amount to very much in terms of voting power in any one state. So let's go on to some other questions people asked. What if a U.S. bank, what if I use a U.S. bank to receive pension and or Social Security income? If I then transfer some of that money to another country where I live, or I withdraw it there with an ATM card, will I be liable for this 3.5%? If you're a non-citizen, absolutely. And lots of non-citizens do get Social Security, because if you work in the United States on a green card, for example, you accumulate the same Social Security benefits as anyone else. And so therefore, this is a matter that should be of concern to you. Now, if you are a U.S. citizen, as I've said earlier, it depends on what the banking sector and the financial money movement industry does. If they decide to slap 3.5% levies on all transfers of funds abroad, then yes, you will end up paying that. And that effectively means that if you are a U.S. citizen and are not required to pay this by law, then you have to wait until the end of the year, add up all of those little receipts, all of those little 3.4 or 3.5% that you spent on maybe going to a restaurant in the city where you live, paying with your credit card there. There's going to be a 3.5% add-on. All that you're going to have to add together, document, prove, and file on your taxes to get your money back. Now, hopefully it won't be that bad. Hopefully they won't actually pass the bill. But as things stand right now, the reality is that pretty much everybody who is a non-U.S. citizen, well, everybody who is, will have to pay that fee. Those of us who are not, we may end up having to pay it and reclaim it, which is, trust me, not what you want to do. It is an almighty hassle already to file U.S. taxes, the worst in the world. It can't get any worse, but this would make it worse. Second question, obvious question. Can you put money in a crypto wallet, move it to another country, or move to another country, and then withdraw that money into a non-U.S. account to avoid it being taxed? Well, it's hard to see how they could stop you, isn't it? And I would guess that the more sophisticated foreign workers earning money in the U.S. that might send it abroad, like all those tech workers up in Silicon Valley, that's exactly what they'll do. And what that raises for me is a very interesting question that relates to the previous question about using ATM cards abroad. As soon as a law like this exists, everybody looks for a workaround. They look for a loophole. So that means that the U.S. government is now going to have to create a great wall around the United States, a great financial wall, and sieve through all the millions and billions of transactions that occur all the time, every day, every year, of people moving money into and out of the United States, and figure out which ones are liable for this tax and under which formats. Now remember, the law doesn't say anything in any detail about this. It says a U.S. person located in the United States who sends money abroad, or sorry, a person, not a U.S. person, a person in the United States who sends money abroad and is a non-citizen must pay this tax. But how do they catch you? How are they going to do that if you draw money out of an ATM? Presumably your bank is going to say they're going to have to create a new system that says this is a non-U.S. person, so therefore anytime any money goes overseas, they'll have to pay that tax. But what about if you just pop across the border to Mexico and draw money, maybe even in U.S. dollars? Are they going to know? I don't know. And particularly when it comes to things like crypto, there are plenty of ways to use that to avoid this bill, and I predict that anybody who can will. And for me, the paradox here is that the Trump administration says it's pro-crypto. Well, I can't think of anything more calculated to disturb the crypto sector than to start forcing the government to peek into crypto wallets and peek into crypto transactions to try to enforce a rule like this. It's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. It's not coordinated with the rest of the administration's policy framework. The next question comes from somebody abroad, and he says, if I am a UK national and I transfer money from my UK bank account into a US bank account, will I have to pay 3.5%? Well, no, because that's money coming in. So if you said $100 to the United States, put it into your bank account, and then withdrew it the same day back to the UK, you'd only be able to withdraw $96.50 because $3.50 would have to be deducted for this new tax. But remember, it's not about money coming in, it's about money going out. So first part of your question, no worries. The second part of the gentleman's question is, what if I use a US brokerage account to invest in US securities? Will I be penalized for investing in the US as a foreigner? Well, technically, yes. Think about it this way. You create an online brokerage account at, maybe Schwab or, somebody in the United States, and you invest in the US economy. Well, your foreign money helps to boost the value of US stocks. It helps all Americans to earn better returns when they invest in the stock market because the market is open to foreigners. But now, if you convert those gains into cash and then withdraw them, you're going to have to pay a 3.5% tax to bring those earnings back to your home country. So on top of capital gains tax, you're now going to have to pay this additional tax. And that at the margin will make a difference for many foreign investors. They will say, well, capital gains plus this 3.5%, my returns are actually not going to be as good. I'd rather invest the money somewhere else in some other country. Now, you think 3.5% doesn't make a difference. Well, for people who are investing multiple millions of dollars, it makes a big difference. And that could be enough to tip money away from the US stock market and direct it elsewhere, depending on how these rules are written. Which leads to the next big question, and that is, how would this work for international businesses that transfer funds from one subsidiary to another and pay their international employees? Good question. Now, those are the kinds of institutions that would be talking in the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. Are foreign companies that operate in the U.S. and send money out going to have to pay the 3.5%? I don't know. But under current U.S. legal theory and practice, or at least U.S. legal opinions by the Supreme Court, businesses are persons, right? So remember back in the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, where it ruled that businesses have the right to contribute money just like individual people. They have First Amendment rights. They have the right to decide on religious issues and make decisions and staffing decisions based on their owners' religious convictions. In other words, the status of corporations in the United States is that of a juridistic person. And this law does not distinguish between natural persons and juridistic persons. So that means that potentially, yes, businesses would be subject to this. My guess is that they won't be subject to it for a very simple reason. Businesses have Congress's ear because they have money. They're the ones who hire lobbyists. They're the ones who make donations to Congress critters, campaigns, and that sort of thing, and so they get what they want. You and I, not so much. Now, the other thing to remember is that most businesses that operate in the United States, that actually have operations here, as opposed to just doing casual investment here, do create U.S. subsidiaries, which in that case would make that business a U.S. entity, which means it wouldn't technically be subject to the tax. But I believe that the entire corporate sector will be essentially relieved of the obligation to pay this tax because they're business, because this is a very pro-business administration, and the bill is aimed at what the framers of the bill think will be your average Mexican migrant worker, but as it's written, it applies right across the board. So they're going to have to go and write regulations that will exempt their friends and the wealthy and so on, and leave it for the rest of us to deal with. So my answer to that question is, if businesses are not going to be exempt already, then you can be sure Congress will make them exempt. Now, the next question is similar in that the person asked, what about foreign governments that invest money in U.S. treasuries and stocks and bonds? Will these be set for that kind of tax? Well, again, there's no way of telling, but there are a couple of things to understand about the treasury market, which is probably the most important single issue in this question from this person who asked. Most treasury trading happens on exchanges, and there are no redemptions of treasury bonds. In other words, when a country like China or Japan or Luxembourg or some other place buys U.S. treasury bonds for their own purposes, they don't then sell those bonds, convert them into cash, and bring the money out of the United States. Instead, what they do is they hold those bonds, sell them, and roll that money back over immediately into new U.S. Treasury bonds. This is particularly true when Treasury yields are rising. So if you hold 30-year maturity Treasury bonds as a sovereign government overseas, and the Treasury yield goes up, then the logical thing to do is to sell them and immediately buy more. So that means that money isn't leaving the U.S., so therefore no 3.5%. But a lot of these trades happen completely outside the United States anyway. Treasury bonds are like any other form of debt, any other financial instrument. They can be traded on exchanges anywhere in the world. And if, for example, a government or company sold U.S. Treasury bonds in Europe and received funds in Europe, then no, that would not trigger the 3.5% tax. But this could potentially cause serious problems if, depending on how the rules are written and how these regulations are interpreted. If anything affects the yields of treasury bonds, if there's even the slightest possibility that the yields of treasuries must be reduced to account for a 3.5% excise tax, that would be catastrophic for the global treasury market because it would instantly make treasuries less attractive. It would lead to a flight from treasuries, which would collapse the dollar, blah, blah, blah. That's why it's not going to happen. So again, you have a situation where the most vulnerable, those who can't vote, non-citizens who do difficult work in the United States are going to be penalized. Those of us who are U.S. citizens, expats who are not wealthy and influential, will have to suffer probably a lot of hassles. But wealthy businesses and foreign governments will be able to escape scot-free because the rules will be written in their favor. Now, call me a cynic, but this is what I have seen happen repeatedly with the United States government under Democrats and Republicans. This is not just a Republican issue. The bottom line is that American expats are typically disregarded as political actors, even more so than ordinary U.S. citizens. There was a study some years ago by MIT that found that the average U.S. citizen's vote has practically no effect whatsoever on what Congress does, whereas those of wealthy business people, wealthy companies, they have enormous influence over law. Now, I don't think that this came from them. I think this came from ideologues in the Trump administration who are bitterly opposed to immigration and want to discourage people from coming. But as always, when you make a rule like this, particularly when you write it in a very brief, sloppy, and unarticulated way, you get unintended consequences. And I'm going to be here looking out for those unintended consequences. And if anything comes up, if I get any more news, if I find out anything else about this bill, I will report back to you ASAP. This is Ted Baumann signing off. I am the Chief of Global Diversification here at International Living.